Welcome to the Mind Spark, bringing you the latest news from around the world. The news hit global markets like a thunderclap. Canada dumps U.S. debt in historic sell-off. For decades, U.S. Treasuries were the world's safest investment, bedrock for nations' reserves. But Canada, America's closest ally, just executed its largest ever sell-off of U.S. Treasury securities. This wasn't a routine adjustment. It was a bold public statement. The timing, just after failed trade talks, was no accident. Markets reeled, analysts scrambled, and Washington was caught flat-footed. Prime Minister Trudeau's office offered only a terse line about diversifying assets. But everyone knew this was about more than finance. The shock was amplified by the source Canada, not a rival, but a trusted partner. U.S. lawmakers saw it as a stunning act of economic defiance. The move signaled that tensions had boiled over, shifting from tariffs and rhetoric to the heart of global finance. For the first time, the world wondered, if Canada could do this, who might be next? The silence from Ottawa was as loud as the sell-off itself. Trust between the two nations was suddenly in question. The era of automatic U.S. financial dominance had been shaken. In Washington, disbelief quickly turned to panic. President Trump and his team were blindsided, scrambling for answers as the news spread. The Treasury Secretary was rushed in for emergency briefings. Calls to Ottawa yielded only polite deflections. U.S. officials tried to downplay the event, calling it a minor portfolio move. But behind closed doors, the fear was real. Would others follow Canada's lead? The Dow plunged, the dollar weakened, and bond traders braced for more volatility. The image of the U.S. as the world's financial safe haven was suddenly in doubt. Critics pounced, blaming the administration's America First approach for alienating allies. For years, the U.S. had relied on global trust to finance its deficits. Now, that trust was visibly eroding. Emergency meetings at the Fed focused on containing fallout and preventing contagion. Every official statement was dissected for clues. The question on everyone's mind: what if the world's creditors start to walk away? The scramble for answers had only just begun. The stakes had never been higher. To grasp the shock, you need to understand U.S. Treasuries. They're the world's safest loans, backed by the U.S. government, never defaulted, and held by nearly every central bank. Treasuries are the foundation of global finance, stabilizing currencies and enabling international trade. The world's appetite for U.S. debt has let America borrow cheaply for decades, funding everything from defense to infrastructure. This exorbitant privilege has underpinned the American way of life. Canada's sell-off wasn't just a financial move, it was a direct challenge to this system. When a stable G7 nation dumps treasuries, it signals that even the risk-free asset carries political risk. The message: U.S. actions can devalue the very assets its allies hold. If trust in treasuries falters, the entire global system wobbles. Canada's move forced the world to ask, is the bedrock as solid as we thought? The implications reach every corner of the global economy. The old certainties are gone. The world is watching for cracks. Canada's sell-off sent shockwaves through global markets. U.S. borrowing costs ticked up as bond prices fell, small at first, but the precedent was alarming. If others followed, rates could soar, making life more expensive for every American. Mortgages, car loans, and credit cards all would feel the impact. The move threatened the very stability that made U.S. debt attractive. But the damage wasn't just financial, it was personal. Trust between the U.S. and Canada, once unshakable, was now fractured. For Washington, it felt like betrayal. For Ottawa, self-preservation. The breakdown made future cooperation on trade, security, and climate far more difficult. The world watched as a model alliance showed signs of fracture. If the U.S. and Canada can't maintain trust, what hope is there for others? The sell-off was a vote of no confidence in U.S. leadership. The era of unquestioned American dominance was suddenly in doubt. Instability and uncertainty filled the vacuum. The aftershocks will be felt for years. This financial bombshell was years in the making. Trump's aggressive trade policies, tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, sparked a tit-for-tat trade war. Canada retaliated with tariffs on U.S. goods, and relations soured. The renegotiation of NAFTA was bitter, with public insults and threats. Beyond trade, the two leaders clashed on climate, Iran, and global institutions. The personal chemistry was poor, and goodwill evaporated. Ottawa realized that tariffs and protests weren't enough. They needed leverage that would get Washington's attention, so they targeted U.S. finances. The Treasury sell-off was a calculated escalation, moving the conflict to the heart of the global system. It was a desperate measure from a cornered ally. The friendship was no longer just strained. It had entered a new phase of quiet economic warfare. The rules of engagement had changed. The world took notice. Canada's move was dramatic, but it's part of a global trend. For years, major economies have been quietly reducing their reliance on the US dollar and treasuries. This de-dollarization is a strategic effort to insulate against US political risk. China and Russia have led the way, selling treasuries and building reserves in gold and other currencies. They're also trading more in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar. For them, it's about national security, protection from US sanctions, and pressure. Even US allies in Europe are hedging their bets, promoting the euro and diversifying reserves. Trump's use of financial power, like sanctions on European firms, accelerated this shift. The desire for autonomy is growing worldwide. As demand for treasuries wanes, US borrowing costs will rise. The exorbitant privilege that fueled American power is eroding. The US can no longer assume it controls the world's financial plumbing. Canada's sell-off was a loud signal. The global retreat from the dollar is speeding up. The world is building alternatives. The old order is fading. The shift away from US treasuries signals a deeper transformation. The unipolar world of US dominance is giving way to a multipolar order. China, Russia, and the EU are asserting their own interests, challenging the status quo. The dollar will remain important, but its monopoly is broken. The euro, yuan, yen, and gold are rising as alternatives. This diversification brings complexity and instability. The US Federal Reserve can no longer act as the world's sole stabilizer. Coordination among competing powers is harder, and crises may spread faster. The stability of the old system is gone. The US must rethink its role, relying less on coercion and more on cooperation. Rebuilding trust with allies like Canada is essential. The era of unilateral action is over. Negotiation and compromise are the new reality. At its core, this is a story about trust. The global financial system depends on confidence in US leadership. Canada's sell-off is a glaring symptom of that confidence in crisis. The Trump administration faces a choice: double down on go-it-alone tactics, or repair alliances and restore trust. The world is watching, and the consequences are enormous. For Canada and others, the challenge is to diversify without triggering panic. The goal isn't to crash the system, but to reform it for a more balanced, multipolar world. The stakes couldn't be higher. If trust keeps eroding, the post-war order could unravel. The question is no longer if the world is changing, but how the US will adapt. Will it cling to dominance or embrace shared responsibility? The answer will shape the global order for generations. The clock is ticking.